40 years ago marked one of humankind's crowning achievements, with the landing of a man on the moon and his safe return to Earth. Tragically, already then, the program and policy that had made such a dream reality and realized the greatest physical return on investment ever known was being dismantled. An overall identity shift turned the United States away from optimism in man's potential and the American system of economic development, towards an existential culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and a British-directed economic policy of empire known as post-industrial globalization. Lawfully, the same cultural shift which destroyed the space program is directly responsible for today's global economic breakdown crisis. This crisis has demolished not only the legitimacy of the current dying monetarist system, but the entire mode of thinking associated with it. Just as the flat earth ideologues were wrong centuries ago, so too are those who today think that mankind is a species limited to the surface of one planet, scrambling over a diminishing supply of supposedly scarce resources. A fundamentally new notion of economy is required, one which embraces the policy of colonization and industrialization of our solar system, driven by man's natural propensity for exploration and discovery of the unknown, and fueled by what Lyndon LaRouche has proposed as a new Hamiltonian credit system, whose spin-off technologies and related scientific breakthroughs will, as history has proven, be more than adequate to meet the physical needs of a growing population of now nearly 7 billion people, at a standard of living never before achieved. But most importantly, will be the shift of national identity towards one of optimism and creative imagination. The German-American space pioneer Kraft Erika, who was instrumental in the early development of the U.S. space program, dedicated his life to elaborating the philosophy of what he called mankind's extraterrestrial imperative. At the dawn of the space age in 1957, he wrote,
"The concept of space travel carries with it enormous impact because it challenges man on practically all fronts of his physical and spiritual existence. The idea of traveling to other celestial bodies reflects to the highest degree the independence and agility of the human mind. It lends ultimate dignity to man's technical and scientific endeavors. Above all, it touches on the philosophy of his very existence."
Over the coming 2 generations, the industrialization and colonization of the Moon and Mars represent the outer bounds of the foreseeable social and scientific challenges for the United States, which, if met in cooperation with other nations, would represent a leap forward in the conscious evolution of the human species. Economic policies for space exploration are based on the same underlying principles as for those on Earth. Unlike monetarism, physical economy is based on the principle that there are no fixed limits to growth. While this principle is reflected in the highest degree in the form of human economy, it expresses a universal principle which is valid in both inorganic and living nature. Our relationship to the planet is unique. Unlike all other species, which live within the bounds of resources they find naturally around them, we survive and grow by using resources faster than they are naturally replenished. Contrary to the environmentalists, however, the difference lies not in our overuse, but rather in our creation of resources. The transformation of an economy powered by food for human and animal labor, to wood and then charcoal for heating, to coal and coke for steam power and metalworking, and into unlocking the power of the atomic nucleus, points to the true resource in human ecology, the creative power of reason which separates us from the beasts. The laws of thermodynamics state that there is a fixed quantity of energy in the universe, but with each fundamental discovery, we develop qualitatively new forms of power. Rather than amend these laws, we should repeal them. While there are hundreds of naturally occurring atomic isotopes, human beings can create and utilize a virtually unlimited number of new isotopes, each with unique properties adding new degrees of freedom to human economic practice. So far, we have largely depended on existing deposits of mineral resources already concentrated by the action of the biosphere, a physical investment cost that we have been able to ignore. Now, the development of nuclear fission and soon fusion give us the ability to overcome our accelerating depletion of the relatively richest concentrations of mineral resources, both by applying very high energy flux densities to extraction and refinement, and eventually through the synthetic production of economically useful elements by transmutation. We also improve the productivity of the biosphere in a uniquely human way, an activity which will represent one of the primary infrastructure costs of maintaining a decent standard of living, costs which will be supported by the increasing ratio of scientifically productive workers. The discovery of nuclear science early in the last century represented a new phase in the evolution of what Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky termed the noosphere. Vernadsky recognized that the energetic activity of life, powered by the sun, which had created the atmosphere, oceans, and the increasingly complex flora and fauna of the biosphere, also created the preconditions for a more powerful geological force to emerge: creative man. Just as the biosphere has developed to higher states of power, so must we. Only by refusing to develop along this natural pathway, only by renouncing our character and regressing to a lower level of existence, will we undo the developmental work of the biosphere and destroy ourselves. But the biosphere is not an isolated system. Far from being an unlikely accident in a small corner of the galaxy, life on Earth is a cosmic phenomenon. Not only are all living organisms either directly or indirectly dependent on the radiant energy of the sun, but the entire space surrounding the planet is permeated with cosmic radiation and other highly structured electromagnetic phenomena, which condition the development of organisms and their environment, and may well play an important role in the evolution of species. We cannot fully understand this dynamic cosmic environment without extending our reach further into space. The formation of the solar system likely began within a disk of plasma spun off from a rapidly rotating young sun. Within this superheated plasma, intense electromagnetic radiation created unique conditions for a phenomenon called polarized fusion, in which the magnetic orientation of atomic nuclei allow for the creation of a rich spectrum of chemical elements, including those heavier than iron, without the violent forces of a supernova usually used to explain their formation. These materials were then distributed according to the harmonic ratios discovered by Johannes Kepler, and condensed into the various planets, as well as the anomalous region in the dissonant interval between Mars and Jupiter that contains the asteroid belt. Meanwhile, anti-entropic evolution accelerated on the Earth. At first, primitive life relied on chemical energy sources within the immediate environment. As this process proceeded to exhaustion, life developed a crucial new technology for overcoming the finite resources of the terrestrial environment: photosynthesis. With the development of the chlorophyll molecule, life for the first time utilized an extraterrestrial energy source on a large scale, drawing energy directly from the sun. This too eventually led to a crisis, as the photosynthesizing organisms created a large and dangerous accumulation of free oxygen, a gas that was then toxic to all living things. Life surmounted this so-called oxygen catastrophe with the evolution of new organisms. With the movement of life from the oceans to the land, culminating in the development of the warm-blooded mammal, life again overcame existing limits to growth. We can trace the flow of such natural resources as iron to demonstrate the upward evolution of the three phase spaces of Vernadsky, from lithosphere to biosphere, and on to the cognitive domain of the noosphere, at no time reaching an entropic steady state of equilibrium. Roughly 2 billion years ago, the iron that had been created in the initial shedding of the young sun found itself homogeneously distributed, in soluble form, in our planet's seas and oceans. At that time, the newly emerging photosynthetic single-celled proterozoa began pumping oxygen into the waters and atmosphere. One effect of that biospheric upshift was the binding of the soluble iron with the oxygen to form a non-soluble compound which precipitated and concentrated into layers on the sea beds around the coasts of what were then continental masses. Those concentrated layers of iron ore became, in one particular area of the globe, the famous ore deposits of modern-day Minnesota and Wisconsin of the Great Lakes region of the United States, where they are mined still today. That same iron ore has subsequently been drawn into the noosphere, where it has been refined and further concentrated and formed into modern rail lines and urban infrastructure, increasing man's dominance on the planet, creating greater potential for human cognitive expansion. The next great barrier to overcome, leaving Earth's biosphere altogether, toward which all prior evolution has been directed, has been left to the willful activity of man. Along with the coming developments in nuclear fusion, we are in a position for the first time in human history to leave behind all the material constraints of the terrestrial environment. With the beginning of manned spaceflight nearly 50 years ago, and the first steps on the moon 40 years ago, the noosphere reached another phase in its evolution, the power to realize mankind's extraterrestrial imperative. We will begin this new phase of interplanetary economics with our nearest celestial neighbor, the Moon. The industrialization of the Moon is the proving ground for productive human operations in space, and will include the establishment of primary industries to build facilities on the Moon, and the export of a handful of precious commodities to Earth, such as the Earth-rare isotope helium-3. The Space Shuttle cargo bay could carry enough helium-3 to power the U.S. for an entire year, meaning that the crash development of the full spectrum of fusion technology to exploit this resource must accompany lunar industrialization. The lunar economy will develop in stages, beginning with nuclear fission-powered research, mining, and industrial facilities. Without a biosphere to concentrate certain minerals, the high energy densities of fission, followed soon after by fusion, will be indispensable in processing huge amounts of lunar material for the export of raw materials for further processing in orbital factories around the Moon or Earth, for the shipment of oxygen, foodstuffs, and other consumables to travelers on their way to Mars, or even more distant destinations, and for the supply of semi-finished goods to be finished in orbit for the spaceships and equipment to go to Mars, all supported by an integrated lunar infrastructure. With a flight time between Earth and the Moon of no more than several days with chemical rockets, and mere hours with fission propulsion, the entire region between the Earth and Moon will be heavily trafficked with freighters and personnel vehicles coming and going on a daily basis, utilizing a continually expanding orbital space infrastructure of communications relays, fuel depots, research stations, and production facilities. The sphere of human activity will thus extend from the entire lunar surface, through the region between the Earth and Moon, down to the entire terrestrial surface, including now inhospitable regions like the deserts, polar caps, and ocean floors that will be opened up by space technology. Once the lunar economy becomes self-sufficient, new cities, and with them new cultures, will emerge on the foundations of lunar industrialization, forming, in effect, Earth's seventh continent. The Moon will be the first extraterrestrial home of mankind. After man has successfully industrialized the Moon, he will turn his sights to the first interplanetary manned mission to Mars. The crew selected for that first voyage will leave our lunar orbit in fusion-powered vehicles constructed by Lunar Industries and arrive at the red planet within the span of several days. Such a voyage must be accelerated by nuclear fusion rockets, preferably at a force of 1 Earth gravity. Man and the rest of life on Earth was designed to live in a gravitational field. Without such gravitation, we incur degenerative syndromes reminiscent of earthbound disorders like osteoporosis. A path through the space-time between Earth and Mars must then be charted in order to provide such an accelerated trip. At this rate of change of motion, man will be the first creature to experience relativistic space-time. A fleet of perhaps 5 ships will carry several dozen crew members to Mars, accelerating until the halfway point and decelerating the other half. When they arrive at Mars, the craft could assemble into an orbiting space station as a communications base between Mars and the Earth. The crew will then be taking turns landing on the surface, where the first manned bases will have already been constructed by robots. These accelerated voyages allow human beings to become the masters of space and time. The first mission will soon be followed by another, developing to the point where there are always several flotillas of ships traveling between the Earth and Mars. Most cargo can be sent on the slow inertial paths which today's short-sighted planners are designating for people, so-called HOMON transfers. These slow cargo craft, reminiscent of today's river barges, will define a subset of a growing network of trade routes throughout the solar system. In our first man-hours spent on Mars, we will collect more knowledge than has been gained in 40 years of sending robotic landers to this planet, which will be retired to Martian museums when they are found by the colonists. We could have the first permanent colonies on Mars within 40 years, and missions to the asteroid belt and the outer gas giant planets soon thereafter, only if current economic policies are changed to those based solely on increasing man's physical power over the universe. Like the change experienced in going from land-based cultures to maritime civilizations through astronavigation, the transformation of humanity's self-conception as a species acting within the universe as a whole moves us farther beyond the infantile bounds of belief in sense certainty. It is this kind of subjective reorientation that lends ultimate meaning to the revolutionary new technologies and scientific discoveries that space exploration produces. For Kraft Erika, the transition of human civilization from a two-dimensional society, limited in thought and action to the surface of the planet, to a three-dimensional society, in which the mental and physical horizons are infinite, represented what he called the cosmic birth of human civilization.
I cannot imagine a more foreboding apocalyptic vision than the fate of a mankind possessed with cosmic powers and condemned to solitary confinement on one small planet. The greatest promise of space is to consider it always a home, never a prison, lest we make it one in the insanity of our smallness.
Man's self-fulfillment lies perpetually in the future, never completed but continuously approached by each succeeding generation. If happiness lies in its pursuit, then there is no happier task for mankind than to extend itself into the unbounded cosmos, where the goal of mere survival gives way to the more interesting challenge of creation. The creation of new technologies, new civilizations, and eventually perhaps even the creation of new planets and new solar systems. The long span of human history and the much longer span of life on this planet prove that technological challenges can always be overcome. Unfortunately, we as a species have yet to take to heart the true lesson that achievements like the moon landings teach us. These lessons are best expressed by what Erica called the 3 fundamental laws of astronautics, which lie at the heart of the extraterrestrial imperative. First law: nobody and nothing under the natural laws of this universe impose any limitations on man except man himself. Second law: not only the Earth, but the entire solar system, and as much of the universe as he can reach under the laws of nature, are man's rightful field of activity. Third law: by expanding through the universe, man fulfills his destiny as an element of life, endowed with the power of reason and the wisdom of the moral law within himself. "21 years ago, in a nationally televised broadcast during the 1988 presidential election called The Woman on Mars, Lyndon LaRouche proposed a comprehensive 40-year program for the colonization of Mars as an economic driver for a United States already in the midst of post-industrial collapse. In many ways, we are farther from that goal today than we were then, having lost not only time, but much of our advanced industrial capability and skilled workforce. More dangerous is the loss of the optimism in the future which is needed for such a project to succeed. Therefore, this moment of crisis is the moment that makes such a radical change in thinking both necessary and possible.